I will simply spend a few minutes telling a couple of stories that are very personal to me. And I'm sharing them with you because each one of these stories encapsulates within it an aspect that we need to learn from Reb Leivik's life. Chof Av was a very difficult year for Yidden in Russia. And Tzadik Gimel was more difficult, and the years were progressively worse from Tzadik Beis until Tzadik Tes. Until Chof Av, Bochum were permitted to learn here and there, and some of the communists let the blind eye, made believe they didn't see. There was a yeshiva, the Machteres in Kremenchuk, the Machteres in Kharkov. These yeshivas were disbanded, and Bochum had to go to this loch and to that loch. A dozen Bochum were sent here and a dozen there. And among those that the cities to which they sent a dozen Bochum was Yekaterinoslav. And among the Bochum that were sent to Yekaterinoslav was an uncle of mine. And I want to tell a few stories that I heard from him personally. Tu B'Shvat, Chof Reish Tzadik Beis, fell out on the Shabbos. Rebbe Leivik never said droshes. He was the Chassidish HoRav in the community. There were a variety of shuls in the community. He davened in one particular shul, the Givus Adosid Imrov shul. He would chazach chassidus there every Shabbos. Tife Maimorim, Tife Biyurim Chassidus. The Amcha, the typical balabos in Yekaterinoslav, was not shaykh to understand his words. The few Chassidish Yidden that were there, and there weren't that many, were also not of the kind and of the level who could understand Rebbe Leivik's Kabbalah in Yonim. Aber misgesessen, zu Shalashudes, when Rebbe Leivik came to Shul, so the Balabatim who were a little bit closer came and they listened. Adroshe Bechlal Bachsidish Rabbonim is given a weite Sach. Zog Godrush. A Balabatische Rov, a Bachsidische Rov. And Rabbi Leivik announced that on Tu B'Shvat he is going to give Adroshe. Adroshe from Rov. Now let's understand, there was a very large Jewish community in Yekaterinoslav, tens of thousands of Jews. But the vast majority of them were not what you and I would consider Chassidish Yidden. There was a very strong Zionist group there, and Bundisten and Paskanyakis, whatever you want, lived in Yekaterinoslav. They had one thing in common, all of them, and that was a meredike der Cheretz for the Rov of Yekaterinoslav. While there was opposition when he first came to take the position, but over time, and over the 20 years that he was already been Meshabesh Barabonis, the whole community was bottled for him. They may have had differences of opinion, but the Rov, and that was not just the case in Yekaterinoslav. That was the case all over Ukraine. The name Rebbe Levi Yitzchok Shneerson was a name that everybody recognized, and recognized for his atzilus, an individual who's mishichmi v'maylo govea mikolom, for the emes, for the Torah that he said. All the Rabbonim of Ukraine were bottled for him. And now Rebbe Levi Yitzchok Shneerson makes the announcement, as geht zogen Adroshe Tu B'Shvat. Now you have to understand also that Tu B'Shvat was something that the communists despised the very idea. Because the Zionists said that Tu B'Shvat is a great Yontif. For Rabbi Leivik to come and say, as geht reden Tu B'Shvat, Ist untergerätzt. And the whole community came. Anoshim, Noshim, V'taf. Everybody came. A full shul. Und der Rov ist Chof Av die Bime. And he asks a simple klotzkasha. We're celebrating Tu B'Shvat, which is Rosh Hashanah Leilonis. But if you go outside, it's cold and it's frozen and you can't walk out without a coat. All the trees are bare. Why is this called Rosh Hashanah Leilonis? It seems like a misnomer. It doesn't belong. The name doesn't belong there at all. Novaden. We celebrate Tu B'Shvat as Rosh Hashanah Leilonis because somewhere far away the sun is shining and there is a tree that is beginning to blossom. Somewhere far away it's warm. Why do we care if somewhere far away it's warm? Because it's Eretz Yisrael. We may be here, but Doten, that's our kesher to Eretz Yisrael is an everlasting one. And he spoke at length. Es ist kalt auf dem Gas. And everybody understood what he was talking about. The metaphor was perfect. The kriris outside, the communism, was such that you had to wear a coat. And he said you have to put on a coat to protect yourself from the cold. But remember hope. Remember the future. Remember the fact that somewhere down the line, we are tied to Eretz Yisrael und dort nis warm. Und als dort nis warm, darf uns sein warm. We too should be warm, knowing that the truth is that this is Rosh Hashanah Leilonis al P'Torah. And the community, everybody, perfectly understood what he was saying. There was a hiserus that emanated from there. We need to be able to galvanize our keches and recognize that it's cold outside. That's one story. The second story. Years later, 10 years later almost, the year is Tafshin. And the Rebbe's mother writes in her diary, Midav zar greiten zach auf Pesach, it's Pesach Tafshin, and there is nothing. And I want to spend a moment explaining to you what nothing means. They sent Rebbe Levi to a town, if you want to call it that, a wild backwater, which was a desert, where trees didn't grow, only cacti. You couldn't find a tree to be able to cover a piece of faschach for a sukkah. It wasn't a town with any kind of organization. It was farmers who got together, a few farmers, and what were they farming already? Basically, it was behemoths. And they got together, and this was a place that they came to sell their wares to little people who were living around them. Die Große Stadt. Chile was a backwater, as were other little towns like that throughout Kazakhstan. And she writes, Midavdoch epes kochen af yontif, mele sinito vos, obe sinito afilo in vos. They had a pail made of tin, and that was their only pot to cook in. And whatever she had cooked already, was mit schon Jahr zu kochen, was chometz after all. Wundent das ein neues Fessel? Where do you get a new pot? Can you imagine? It was a town, such a backwater, you couldn't buy a new pot. But she knew that 4 hours away there was a community called the Monazach Baldena Minut. Nicht Gzilo da. Yanikugan. Gzilo da, ich bin a Shtetl. Yanikugan. And in Yanikugan, there was also some people fashikt. Among them was my grandfather, who was a Rov there. Benzin Gaisinski was there as a sheikhet, mit a Beden fashikt from Kiev. And the head of the Frum community in Kiev also, a Yid whose name was Moshe Kolikov, hat man eich fashikt dahin. So because they had a sheikhet, und hat gebracht mit sich a Chalef, so they could shech the beheme. And the shtetl given a bissel größer, but the shtetl was 4 hours away. 4 hours by train. So the Rebbetzin went, got a ticket, spent 4 hours going there. She went to my grandfather's house, who called Moshe Kolikov, mit ihr eingeordnet. Fleisch und Fisch und mit gemacht an Nayum Emer of Pesach. They went to a blacksmith and they got him to take a new piece of tin and they made an Emer, a pail. That's what they cooked in. Und sie gewinnt Simcha besossen. Sie fragen ein Emer und sie sagen ein Stückel Fleisch und sie fragen ein Stückel Fisch. Und nicht nur das, mit gebackt Matze dort. Stellt sich vor. Und sie gewinnt Matze Schmureich. She came back to Chile, a freilacher Mensch. They wouldn't let her carry the fish and the meat. She carried the matzah, but they sent a special messenger. That's how they had derech eretz for Rebbe Levi and his Rebbetzin. She's going to go and schlep shopping bags. They sent somebody specially that she shouldn't have to schlep it. She brought the matzah. And she writes there, mir schon gemacht Pesach. Mir gemacht Pesach und a Seder, and they even had an Eirach of Pesach. And then she finishes off this keta saying, was hat men gered ban Seder? Wir haben gered wegen dem Ova von Jiden, wegen dem Heve hat men nicht gered. We didn't talk about the present. We spoke about the past. And we spoke about the future with hope. Sitting there in a hovel among the Uzbeken. And she writes there were Goyim outside making fun. They were singing a little bit. And the Goyim was standing and throwing rocks, little stones at the window. And what were they talking about? They were talking about the Hoive. Whatever it is today. We don't dwell on the problems of now. We need to think with hope and with bitochen that the Osid will be different. That's Rebbe Levik's message, the Rebbetzins message of the first Pesach that they spent in Chile. Im Mokem is faran v'sivar im Platz, and we know that in Zman there will be Mirz Hashem Anosid. Nochum. As a sidebar, my uncle told me he went into Rebbe Levik, and Rebbe Levik was very happy to see he and another bacher went in, and he said, "Oh, let me sagen l'chaim." And they brought out mashke. This is back in Yekaterinoslav. They brought out mashke, and he said, "Bamir is haint a yontif." Yontif? He said, Mir is haint a Yontif because today I received a letter from my son. And I'm going to quote verbatim as I heard it from my uncle. Hat mir schon lang übergejogt. He passed me a long time ago. Membele, ich gave a Yontif by him. And he wanted to say l'chaim with a couple of bochim. That's a sidebar. Nochum. Everybody knows. We've spoken about it many times. The Rebbe gerät wegen them. The Mesiras Nefesh of the Rebbetzin to make ink so he should be able to write. And Rabbi Winner pointed out, Cholam gehen schreiben for Wemmen. Wemmen zumal onkommen. It was a dream. The whole thing was so far-fetched that sitting there in that gullus, we can't even imagine the depth of gullus. There's not a human being to talk to. Nothing. Dust in the streets and Wilder's becken. That's all it is. And somebody of that kind of character has to sit among these people. I mean, it's just, sie nicht zu leben, as er sagt. And what was he thinking? What was she thinking? Sie Mesiras Nefesh to be able to schreiben a Stücke Torah. Years later, the Rebbetzin was able to leave Russia, and on the way coming to the United States, like all of us who went through that Golus, she stopped in Poking, and she spent a number of months in the winter of Tovshin Zion in Poking. Poking was an old army base with long barracks. In every barrack, which was 100 feet long, every 10 feet they had another family living. So they divided with plywood, divided up the long barracks into rooms 10 feet wide, about 7 or 8 feet, and every family had a room. It just so happened that the Rebbetzins' room was next to our room, next to my parents and my room. So on the day of my bar mitzvah, I'm telling you a ganze Maise, it was interessant. I was walking to 770, and I meet the Rebbetzin on Kingston Avenue. And I said to Hein, mir geworden bar mitzvah. So she says to me, Du gedenkst, ich bin den gelaufen in Poking und unter na Jammelke? Do you remember? And she laughed. I was a year old. Do I remember her chasing me to put on a Jammelke when I was a year old? Ein bisschen schwer zu gedenken von a Jahr alt. And she says, and I'm repeating it because I want everybody to hear it, dafke because it's on a Zoom. And she says to me, Ich hab gehört von my man, I heard from my husband, that a child should never be let out, begilui rosh, without a hitalongeton. My mother would let me outside, and she put on a little hat gerade, and I didn't like it, so I tore it off. So she spent her time chasing me when I went outside to put the hat on my head, weil sie hat gehört vom Mann, als a Kind lost mir nicht a Ruiz, on a Jammelke, was ist negeh zu Yira Shemayim. And gerade today I learned the Gemara, was a Gemara meforeshes. The Gemara erzählt, Rab Nachman bar Yitzchok says that his mother heard from a soothsayer, some goy said that this boy is going to be a ganef. And she was very much afraid. Somebody had gesagt that Divrei Nevi'is of Rab Nachman bar Yitzchok is going to be a ganef. So how do you make sure that the child is going to grow up properly? So the Gemara says she never let him outside begilui rosh. She never let him walk outside without making sure that he had covering on his head. And she says, the Gemara says so. Ki heichad leheila yiras shamayim, poshet kipshute. So Rabbi Levi was medayik, told her, Aim said, it's going on the Gemara. Aim said, Rishmai Aleim. Yeah. Es ist eine Sache zu wissen, mit Tornicht, a ruislosener Kind, every child needs to walk around at all times, dafke bekisse rosh. And one final word, halben Wörterle. The Hakoras HaTev that the Rebbe had, the Rebbe's in Zogeret, but the Rebbe had privately and didn't show publicly, the Kibbut Av, the Kibbut Av from the Rebbe we saw. We saw the Rebbe's Kibbut Av. They're going to the mother all the time, the way he looked at her, the way he, everything, just the whole yachas. Those of us who were there and saw it, ein kedugmosa. But the Kibbut Av, anybody who did anything for Reb Leivik, anything at all, privately and only privately, the Rebbe acknowledged and thanked and was mekarev specially for it. Stiller reit, a nod. My father used to say, the Rebbe told my father every Chof Av to say l'chaim. A nod. A halben word. A nod, and that's it. He knew he had to say l'chaim. Because my father also traveled a number of times to give Reb Leivik to machen besop kochen for him, whatever the case was. Be mishamish Reb Leivik. So, was darf mir nehmen davon? Wir nehmen an Hoges, was ist Scheiches zu uns. The first thing is, mir guckt nicht auf die Zores, was mir leid. Jeder einer, a Bocher hat seine kleine Geschäften. Everybody has issues that he's dealing with, pressures that he's dealing with in the Hoive. And they can get you down. These pressures can really oppress you. And if they get you down, you can't think properly. And certainly not bepoil anything. The lessons for the few stories I told was you never let outside pressures get you down. Was ist fran an osid? If it's difficult here, but somewhere else, there's a reason for this, but somewhere else somebody is able to make up and you will gain from it later on. Never to be limited or mitzumtzim by the Schwierigkeiten and the difficulty we're going through. Ein Sach. Und the zweite Sach is, never ever forget the Hakoras HaTev. To be able to say thank you properly. The Avas Reim that it builds. It's a lesson that we saw from the Rebbe all the time. The Yashakeach, every time somebody poured a glass of water. The Yashakeach of the Rebbetzin, we saw his constant yachas to people like Reb David Raskin, that was Mishamish Reb Leivik in his last half a year. I mean, the yachas was unbelievable. The Rebbe was miyaker, everything that David Raskin or Shalom did, because at Mishamish in the Taten. Der Rebbe ist zu helfen. Wir sollen sich etwas ablernen davon, der erste Sache. Und zweitens, miyaker sein Al-Koponim, was der Rebbe hat uns gewollt lernen davon. L'chaim, l'chaim.